energy investments, and other countries like Italy, Mexico, and Argentina are rapidly increasing their investments. The United States, on the other hand, is falling behind. If we are not willing to make long-term investments, we risk limiting our competitiveness in the years to come, something we simply cannot afford to do. So I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your testimony, and I want to, as we look at this particular problem, I want to know how it is that, are we looking at one situation here, or are we doing a blanket indictment of all our efforts in this regard? Because I think we can, if we're going to paint with one brush this entire effort, I think that would be a major mistake. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does anyone else wish to make an opening statement? All right. With that, we'll introduce our panel. We first have with us Mr. Gregory Friedman, who is the Inspector General at the United States Department of Energy. We want to thank Honorable Friedman for being here today. Mr. Elliott Lewis is the Assistant Inspector General for Audit at the U.S. Department of Labor. We also have with us Dr. David Montgomery, Senior Vice President of National Economic Research Associates Incorporated, and is formerly Assistant Director of the CBO, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Energy. As I indicated earlier, Mr. Katz is on his way. And we also have with us Mr. Brett McMahon, who is President of Miller & Long, D.C., and we appreciate our panel being here. We're going to go ahead and swear you guys in. When Mr. Katz gets here, we'll do that. This is the rules of the committee, so if you'll just please stand up, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? If you do so, just answer in the affirmative. Let the record show that everyone answered in the affirmative. You guys know the rules, 5 minutes, you get the light system there. So stick to that as best you can, and we'll start right down the road here with Mr. Friedman. You are recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify today at your request on the work of the Office of Inspector General concerning the Department of Energy's implementation of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. The intent of the Recovery Act was to quickly stimulate the economy and create jobs while fostering an unprecedented level of accountability and transparency. The Department received $35.2 billion in Recovery Act funding, dramatically increasing the budgets traditionally available for initiatives such as home weatherization, environmental cleanup, science projects, and loan guarantees to advance energy technologies. With the passage of the Recovery Act, the Office of Inspector General immediately launched efforts to assist the Department. We've issued 68 reports covering all major Recovery Act initiatives and activities, initiated over 100 Recovery Act-related criminal investigations, and conducted 300 fraud awareness briefings around the country for nearly 16,000 Federal, contractors, State, local, and other officials. Based on our body of work, we found the efforts by the Department to use Recovery Act funds to stimulate the economy was more challenging than many had originally envisioned. Our reviews identified a fairly consistent pattern of delays in the pace at which Recovery Act funds have been expended by grant and other financial assistance recipients. As of October 22, 2011, according to the Department's own records, recipient organizations had spent only 55% of available Recovery Act funds. In terms of the Department's ability to meet the Recovery Act goals, we found that weatherization work, for example, was often of questionable quality. In one recent State-level report, we found that 9 of the 17 homes visited failed inspections because of substandard workmanship. The success of the weatherization program was affected by other management issues as well. For example, one major subrecipient gave preferential treatment to its own employees and their relatives for weatherization services over other eligible residents who were elderly or who had special needs. The loan guarantee program could not always readily demonstrate through documentation how it resolved or mitigated relevant risks prior to granting loan guarantees, and one of the Department's environmental management sites, relying on Recovery Act funded, adopted an approach to radioactive waste processing that could have cost about $25 million more than necessary. Further, the Office of Inspector General is investigating various Recovery Act-related schemes, including submission of false information, mischarging, and misrepresenting test results. To date, these investigations have resulted in over $2.3 million in monetary recoveries as well as a number of criminal prosecutions. This includes a series of cases involving fictitious claims for travel per diem, resulting in the recovery of $1 million alone in Recovery Act funds. The Recovery Act established extremely challenging goals for the Department. Notwithstanding the Department's intense effort to meet these goals, we had a number of overarching observations about the Recovery Act's implementation. These included, first, the demanding nature of the Recovery Act's implementation placed an enormous strain on the Department's then-existing infrastructure. Second, dealing with a diverse and complex set of departmental stakeholders complicated the Recovery Act startup, administration, and execution. Third, although shovel-ready projects were the symbolic goal of the Recovery Act, in most cases, execution was more challenging and time-consuming than had been anticipated. Fourth, infrastructure at the State and local levels was overwhelmed. Ironically, in several States, those charged with implementing the Recovery Act's provisions had been furloughed due to economic conditions in those States. Fifth, the pace of actual expenditures was significantly slowed because of the time needed to understand and to address specific requirements of the Recovery Act. And finally, recipients of Recovery Act funding expressed their frustration with what they described as overly complex and burdensome reporting requirements. In summary, a combination of massive funding, high expectations, and inadequate infrastructure resulted at times in less than optimal performance. Over the next year, we will further review Recovery Act expenditures in a number of high-risk areas, and our investigative efforts continue. Additionally, we are evaluating how the Department plans to deal with the loss of over 4,000 environmental management jobs by the end of this year, a significant downsizing of the workforce that was dedicated to Recovery Act-funded work. Further, we are refining our observations on the Department's implementation of the Recovery Act and are drafting a report to highlight other lessons learned from this experience. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that you or the subcommittee may have.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony. Mr. Lewis, you are now recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on the OIG's recent report regarding the Department's Green Jobs program. As part of our oversight responsibilities and in response to a congressional request, we conducted this audit to determine how the Employment and Training Administration had defined green jobs, how they used the $500 million in funds provided by the Recovery Act, and what the grantees had reported achieving with respect to training and placement of workers, including employment retention. The OIG's findings and recommendations are based on the latest data reported by the grantees to ETA as of June 30, 2011. We found that ETA defined green jobs as jobs associated with products and services that use renewable energy sources, reduce pollution, and conserve natural resources. ETA derived this definition from the Green Jobs Act, the Energy Policy Act, and from its own database of occupational requirements and worker attributes. The Recovery Act mandated that the funds be used for projects that prepare workers for careers in energy efficiency and renewable energy as described in the Workforce Investment Act. Therefore, we determined that the definition of green jobs used by ETA to award grants was in compliance with the requirements of the Recovery Act. The second objective of our audit was to determine how the funds had been used. We found that of the $500 million provided, ETA awarded the majority of the funding, or $435 million, for training programs to prepare workers, help targeted populations overcome barriers to employment, help participants obtain industry-recognized credentials, and place them into green jobs. Overall, our audit found that although ETA obligated all of the $490 million in grants as of June 30, 2011, grantees had reported expenditures of $163 million, or 33% of the amount awarded, while approximately 73% of the training and non-training grant periods had already elapsed. Our audit also evaluated what grantees had reported achieving with respect to training and placement of workers, including employment retention. We found that with 61% of training grant periods having elapsed, grantees have reported achieving limited performance targets for serving and placing workers. Grantees reported that 53,000 individuals were served, 42% of the targeted 125,000. 47,000 participants enrolled in training, about 40% of the targeted 115,000. 26,000 participants completed training, 27% of the targeted 97,000. and 8,000 participants were placed into employment, 10% of the program's goal of 80,000. And finally, 1,300 participants retained employment for more than 6 months, about 2% of the planned 70,000. It is important to emphasize that these training programs are still underway, and we would expect to see changes in the reported results by the time the programs are completed. In response to our audit, ETA officials stated that they expected performance to significantly increase over time due to an initial lag during the startup phase of the grants. However, ETA could not demonstrate that grantees were on target to meet planned outcomes, nor was there a plan to ensure that they could. In addition, according to interviews we conducted with ETA regional officials early this year, grantees had expressed concerns about the overall poor economic conditions, and the green jobs had not materialized, and therefore job placements had been much less than expected. As a result, we are concerned as to whether grantees will effectively use the funds and deliver targeted employment outcomes by the end of their grants. Accordingly, we recommended that ETA evaluate the Green Jobs Program, and in so doing obtain a current estimate of funds each grantee will realistically spend given the current job market and the demand for green job-related skills. This will help the Department identify and correct any performance issues before the grants expire and assess whether the grant funds will remain unspent and could therefore be recouped and returned to the U.S. Treasury so they can be available for other purposes. In response to our recommendations, ETA stated that it has put in place appropriate measures to monitor progress and provide technical assistance to help ensure ultimate grant success for those grantees that may be at risk of not delivering all of their outcomes. ETA further stated that it has obligated all of its Recovery Act funds and that it expects all funds will have been expended by September 30, 2013 as required by the Office of Management Budget. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, based on the results of our audit, we believe the Department has an opportunity to evaluate the performance of the Green Job Program while it is underway in order to correct any performance issues and maximize outcomes. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify on our work, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that you or any members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Dr. Montgomery, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I think I can summarize my testimony in 5 points. First is that the project failures and wasted money that we are discussing today are not isolated examples of improper execution of an otherwise worthwhile and potentially successful program. The entire concept of using stimulus funds to create a green economy through energy spending is misguided. Second point I would make to develop that is that green energy has none of the characteristics that are required to make effective use of stimulus funding. In countering a recession, the objective is to expend funds as quickly as possible, and Mr. Friedman has pointed out that that hasn't been happening, and also to phase out that spending as the economy improves. This kind of stimulus objective is simply inconsistent with the Department of Energy's mission. Applying this public works approach to energy would repeat the cycle of boom and bust that has contributed to the failure of most of our past efforts to deploy and to develop and deploy new energy technology. So my third point would be that the Recovery Act funds have also been applied at the wrong end of the research, development, and deployment spectrum, whereas there is the least economic rationale for government involvement and the highest likelihood of waste and failure. I point out in my written testimony the great disproportion that existed in the Department of Energy even before the stimulus funds compared to other research organizations in terms of how much money goes into basic research and how much goes into funding for large-scale demonstration projects. The stimulus program made that far, far worse. Now, the reason that economists give for a government role in R&D is the inability of private researchers to appropriate the full value of their research. This is a serious problem across the board in basic and in some applied research, but it's only a problem at the deployment and commercialization stage if there's no market for their product. The second point is that peer review makes it possible for government research organizations to do a good job of allocating funds to basic research, but government has proven over and over again that it cannot consistently pick winners in the application of known technology. And finally, there's a reason why so much money goes into this deployment and technology demonstration and why it fails. These are the projects that have electoral significance. They attract lobbying, rent-seeking, and pork-barrel politics, and therefore become to be chosen independent of either their economic or technical merit. My fourth point would be that the kinds of upfront funding provided by the Recovery Act basically create hothouse plants. And I think this has a lot to do with what we saw in Solyndra and with other bankruptcies that we're seeing today. Some of these hothouse plants will survive. My wife is occasionally lucky, but it's the exception. And again, there's a reason for the failures. Upfront funding is not a universal substitute for the lack of a market. Green is not enough. Green technology that produces energy that costs more than its current fossil or nuclear substitutes is not going to be purchased, and consumers are not going to be willing to pay enough to cover the cost of ongoing business for many of the projects that are being funded under the Recovery Act. The Recovery Act, therefore, has turned into a backdoor and ineffective substitute for what Congress has decided it does not want, a price on carbon. If there's no price on carbon, there's going to be not much of a market for green technology, and these projects will fail. Now, in other words, if it's not a good idea to put a price on carbon, it's an even worse idea to loan money and fund projects that need it in order to survive. So that, I think, would be my final point, that, in my opinion, it is very likely that most of the Recovery Act projects will fail in one of three senses. Some will fail to survive even with the subsidy that's provided in upfront funding and loans, if the value of their product in the market isn't enough to cover the ongoing cost of producing it. And I think, to be fair, many of these projects were originally conceived with the hope that there would be a price on carbon, as Mr. Kucinich pointed out. Second, the Recovery Act funding will fail to jumpstart technologies or industries, because if every new venture has to have an upfront subsidy in order to overcome the capital barrier that exists because we don't put a price on carbon and don't have a market demand for green technology, then things will end with the Recovery Act projects. And finally, it seems that to me that these projects will fail to provide a return to the taxpayer ever if the Recovery Act if the Recovery Act is supporting projects that can't pass the cost-benefits test on their own. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Montgomery. Mr. Katz, if you'd please rise. We just need to swear you in. You walked in just after we swore everyone else in. So if you just please stand up and stand, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If you do, just answer in the affirmative. All right. Thank you, Mr. Katz. Sorry about that. We know you were caught in traffic, and we're welcome you to the committee, and you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My background is in finance. I have an MBA from Stanford. I worked as the Director of Financing for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy in the Department of Energy for the last 10 years. I've been involved in private equity financing for clean energy. I've been involved in funding billions of dollars of clean energy projects, both at a project development and a venture capital perspective. The way I look at that is from a finance perspective, and I can say that our international competitors, Japan, Germany, and China, are not sitting still. They are heavily subsidizing this race to a clean energy future, which is a transition that pretty much all companies, certainly the U.S. military and the large majority of governments now recognize we're involved in. So the support for AR funding in clean energy, although it's had a steep ramp-up and had some teething problems, on balance was well-timed and has been very important in supporting the U.S. ability to compete in this critical area. A recent Brookings study found that between 2003 and 2010, in this clean energy area, there has been an 8.3% job growth. It has been one of the most important areas of job growth domestically, and is an area that our competitors are investing in. So in terms of economic opportunity and job growth, it's been an important driver for the economy. The U.S. military is committed to clean energy because, in its view and based on its actual experience, clean energy allows them to deliver their military purpose and security more cost-effectively than reliance on fossil fuels. So the security dimension of clean energy has become much more important. The U.S. military has been very clear on this particular issue. There was several independent, nonpartisan reviews about the impact of ARRA funding on clean energy. The Council of Economic Advisors in November of 2010 found that as of the third quarter of 2010, between 2.7 and 3.7 million new jobs had been created from this ARA funding, and that it had a positive impact on GDP of 2.7%. In May 2011, U.S. Congressional Budget Office found that in the first quarter of 2011, the impact of this AR funding had been an increase of between 1.1 and 3.1% GDP growth, and an increase in full-time employment of between 1.6 million and 4.6 million people. These success stories are being built on. As discussed, this very steep ramp-up in funding was hard to deliver because the personnel were not there. As that funding gets deployed in the field, we expect to see increase in economic productivity and an increase in employment. The last point I would make is that the OMB, in its 1705 loan guarantee program, assumed and budgeted for a 12.8.5% default rate, an almost 13% default rate. Solyndra and more recently Beacon, which went bankrupt, represented about 1.6% of that total funding. We expect to receive back a portion, that is, recover a portion of that funding. So the total default rate to date, based on these two companies, it will be about 1%. That is less than 1/10 of the projected default rate expected for and planned for by OMB. About 90% of AR funding goes to large clean energy generation projects. The large U.S. companies like General Electric, who are competing in international markets, have found this funding critical to their ability to compete and to expand and build on jobs. Funding for Johnson Controls, for example, in building a 3,000-person clean battery production facility in Michigan, will create 3,000 direct jobs and many more indirect jobs at a cost of under $100,000 per job. So it's not a perfect story, but given the rate of ramp-up expected from this funding, the success story, I think, has been pretty clear. At least 1 million to 3 million jobs created, a lot of strengthening of U.S. competitiveness on this critical international issue. And for investors in clean technology, it's really a commitment to the future. It's really a vote for those who are optimistic about America's capacity to compete successfully in this critical market. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Katz. Mr. McMahon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Kucinich, and other members of the subcommittee. My name is Brett McMahon. I'm president of the recently founded Miller & Long D.C. Inc. We're a Washington, D.C.-based subcontractor. My previous employer, Miller & Long Company, Inc., was founded in D.C. in 1947. It's one of the nation's oldest and largest subcontractors. The company regularly employs approximately 1,500 people as form building carpenters, cement finishers, reinforcing rodmen, layout engineers, equipment operators, laborers, everything that you could think of under the sun for our particular trade. We've provided employment for over 75,000 D.C. area residents over the last 64 years. During my 19 years in construction, I personally have overseen over 50 high-rise concrete structures and have been proud to provide employment for over several thousand construction workers, both here in D.C. and in the Carolinas. Also active in a number of organizations here locally, including the D.C. Construction Trades Academy at Cardozo Senior High School, where we provide the only vocational training available for construction workers in the District of Columbia. I first heard the term green-collar jobs about 4 years ago. Like many, I was not sure what the term meant. Since so much of the focus seemed to center around my industry, I thought it would be wise to at least learn some more about it. I learned over time that the term was actually a lot more political than actual, being clear that it was just a new label on jobs that actually have existed for years. A lot of the public relations effort has gone into trying to claim there's something new here, and unfortunately that's not the case. Considering this, very pleased the following example, because I thought this is the clearest I've ever seen, by a gentleman named Mark Anderberg from the Texas Workforce Development Commission in a report labeled Green-Collar Workers and Other Mythical Creatures. In it, if you have the testimony in front of you, you'll see a picture of 2 different toilets. One is a low-flow toilet, one is the old-fashioned one. And the question that begs from this is, what are the skill differences for installing these 2 things? What is the possible difference between installing this one and that one? And the problem is there isn't one. However, the claim is that somehow they are trying to say that there's a new job created because you can install the low-flow toilet instead of the old one. For a non-construction example, I hope we could all agree that the skills necessary to drive an electric car are the same skills necessary to drive the largest SUV. Same driver can operate either vehicle just as the same plumber could install either toilet. The difference is in the product and not the operator. However, a great deal of effort and tax dollars have gone to the purpose of convincing the public that the plumber installs a low-flow toilet should now be called a green-collar plumber, and that the new label should count as a new job. This kind of thing makes those of us in construction wonder where somebody would come up with that idea. There is something important about the new label that I did not understand at first. If the new label is more than just a political talking point, but is actually a formal new capital O occupation title per the U.S. Department of Labor, then a new problem is created. When a new occupation is designated for the construction industry, a new set of standards is developed. In addition to the antiquated and complex determination of a prevailing wage, a new apprenticeship training standard is established, even though, in this case, the only difference is in nomenclature, not in skill set. With that understanding, I will relate how this program unfolded in the District of Columbia. On October 4, 2007, I attended a meeting in the D.C. Department of Employment Services. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss the rollout of the Green Collar Jobs Initiative. The meeting was basically handled by the staff from the Center for American Progress. The handout we received is attached to this document. I kept it because it laid out the goals of their program very clearly. Even included, for the first time I'd ever received one from a D.C.-based meeting, a bar chart schedule detailing new mandatory apprenticeships that would be required to work on any project covered by the then brand new, at that time, D.C. Green Building Act. This proposal was a great concern to me because it took my company 26 years to get our apprenticeship program passed by the D.C. Apprenticeship Council. In fact, the only reason we were finally accepted was because the Apprenticeship Council at that point had its first and only non-union member. Union control of apprenticeship boards is a common roadblock for the 87% of construction workers who have chosen the merit shop over unions. So when a new occupation gets its own apprenticeship training standards, the participating employers must apply to have their program accepted. Having spent the better part of 3 decades getting our current program accepted, we were not looking forward to going through the whole process again. In the district, there is a local hiring ordinance known as First Source, which includes mandatory registered apprenticeship participation. First Source only applies to those projects that receive a certain level of assistance from the district government. What is shown in this handout is that the advocates were planning to take the First Source mandatory apprenticeship concept to a new level. The inset here from the project schedule is taken from that handout. The advocates were planning to make new green-collar apprenticeship mandates apply to every project covered by the new D.C. Green Building Act. Unfortunately, the D.C. Green Building Act actually covers every brick and stick, public or private, inside the city limits of Washington, D.C., and we were basically looking at being barred from working inside the district. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McMahon. We appreciate everyone's testimony. Mr. Friedman, Mr. Lewis, based on your testimony, it looks like both this weatherization program and the Green Jobs Training Program are, by I guess anyone's conclusion, just a complete failure. And I want to start with you, Mr. Lewis, and walk through this based on your testimony. If I think I got the numbers right, $490 million is out the door, but only $163 million has been spent. Is that accurate?
Correct. That was as of June 30th.
Okay. And how many, the 162.8, 163 million spent, how many people have been trained?
Completed training, 26,000 people.
And how many now have a job that's how many have been successful, been trained and actually are working in this area and have a job that for any length of time, let's say 6 months?
Of the 26,000, about 8,000 people were placed into a job.
And do you know the math on that? So we've spent $163 million and trained 20-some thousand. Only 8,000 have actually received a job. You know how much we're spending per person?
I didn't. I had not calculated.
Several $1,000s, probably, right?
Yes.
Maybe even close to. I mean, maybe approaching. Well, it wouldn't be quite 100 million, but or 100,000, but lots of money spent per job. Do you see any way? In fact, what were the targets that the Department of Energy had laid out?
Department of Labor.
Department of Labor, I'm sorry.
The total grants added up to a plan to train about 97,000 people. We're at 26,000 have been trained at this point.
Okay.
I do believe at the end of June there were around 20,000 people that were in the program.
All right. And do we know anything about the folks in this program? Have they been laid off? Are they on unemployment? I mean, what do we know about the people in the program? Do we know?
Some of the people in the program were unemployed, although there were some of the grants were also designed to target incumbent workers, so workers who were already employed but wanted to upgrade their skills to qualify for a green job or to maintain a job.
Okay. And so I guess there's two perspectives to look at. You got several thousand people who have been trained. Some of them may have been receiving some kind of benefit from the taxpayer. Now the taxpayer is helping them get trained, so they could be receiving unemployment and getting these additional dollars spent. Most of them are not getting a job. So we got the harm to the taxpayer, but frankly also the harm to the individual who went through this training and has maybe not a whole lot to show for it.
If we've trained them in something that there's not a job for, then yes, we're not doing them the best.
Did you think there's any way we can recover? You said $490 million out the door, but only 163 spent. Is there any way we can recover the additional, the over, $200 and some million dollars?
Well, of course, those numbers were as of June. So as of this quarter, which we don't have the reports in yet, there would be more funding spent. I don't know how much.
But isn't there at some point when you say this program is not working? This actually reminds me of another program we've had hearings on, the HAMP program, which was designed to help 4 million homeowners stay in their homes and helped a few thousand. Lots of money out the door, but lots of money hasn't. So is there any way you think we can get the money back, not do any more harm to people, put them in training that's not going to benefit them, and actually get the money back for the taxpayer?
Yeah, and that's what we've asked the Department to do, to look at how much at this point has not been spent, and if it isn't going to be.
So is it the Inspector General of the Department, is your recommendation that we stop the program?
I would want to have more information from the Department because we.
How much more do you need when you look at these numbers and how bad they are? How much more do you need to say this is just not working?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I know there's 20,000 people in the mill at the end of June. Whether these numbers are going to pick up, there's something we haven't seen. I can't say.
Yeah, but I mean, at some point we say, how much longer do we give them?
The placement numbers are very far behind.
Yeah, very bad. And is there ever a chance they catch up to the targets they said they were going to hit?
They could catch up to their targets for serving. They would have to make a significant increase to catch up with their placement targets.
Exactly. Mr. Freeman, real quickly, because I got about 40 seconds here. The weatherization program, you mentioned, I think in your testimony, if I got it right, 9 of 17 homes you visited. Was this homes or commercial?
Homes.
Okay. So homes you visited did not pass inspection.
That's correct.
And how were these 17? Did you select them? Did the Department of Energy tell you to? How were these 17 selected?
They were not selected by the Department of Energy. We don't work that way, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. You just randomly picked them, or?
They were picked in conjunction with the states in some cases. This is one example. There are other examples in other jurisdictions of rejection rates because of inadequate work and poor quality work.
So, but based on your sample, over half.
That's correct.
Over half the homes didn't meet the requirements.
In that jurisdiction, that's correct.
So I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Mr. Lewis. Is this weatherization program, based on what you've seen out there, over half the homes not meeting the criteria that's outlined and meeting the standard, is this a program we should end?
Mr. Chairman, that is requires an extensive answer, so let me give me a minute or two if you don't mind. This program has been in effect since the mid-1970s. The funding on an annualized basis for the last several years has been about $400 million a year.
It seems to me it doesn't matter how long it's been in existence. If it's bad, it's bad, and well, they should have ended a long time ago. Maybe that's a reason but that shouldn't prohibit us from doing the right thing and ending if it's that bad.
Absolutely, and I'm not suggesting that's the case. What I am suggesting is the fact that the program has a long history. It is a mixed bag. I wouldn't say it's a total failure. There have been some successes, a number of successes. There are Department reports that over 500,000 homes have been weatherized around the nation. So there have been some successes. There have been some failures. I think I would suggest that we fix it, not necessarily end it.
Okay. Not a total failure, just a failure in a lot of ways. With that, I will yield to my friend from Ohio, gentleman, Mr. Kucinich.
Mr. Freeman, you're not recommending, though, that the United States government suspend all weatherization programs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And this recent audit was 9 of 17 weatherized homes that were visited failed inspections because of substandard workmanship. You're not concluding based on that all weatherization programs don't work. Is that right?
That's correct. But Mr. Kucinich, let me put this in some perspective. We visited 10 or 20 states around the nation, and this was reflective of one particular jurisdiction and one particular community action, the work of one particular community action organization. There were problems in a number of jurisdictions that need to be corrected if the program is going to be continued. The purpose of what we were trying to achieve is a sort of a lessons learned. Here's what's gone wrong. Here's what needs to be corrected if the political judgment is to continue this program going forward.
Well, let's look at this. I mean, who uses weatherization programs? And primarily lower-income people. So are we, we don't want to be in a position as a subcommittee in recommending that lower-income people don't get help that they need. We want to do everything we can to lower their energy costs. So I think that this subcommittee has to be very, very careful about drawing any sweeping conclusions about failures that may exist in some areas. And I'll certainly yield to my friend.
Well, I think the gentleman makes a good point, but we certainly don't want to, whether it's a green jobs training program or a weatherization program, have a program that doesn't work, that on one hand gives people false hope, on the other hand doesn't give them the standard that they're required, that they're entitled to get if we're going to have the program.
You and I are 100% in concurrence on saying that if Federal dollars are being spent, we expect the workmanship to be good. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I support Davis-Bacon requirements. It's a workmanship issue. And so I think that, we're on the threshold of another winter. It snowed here last weekend. Temperatures are dropping. There's poor people shivering in their homes. We don't want to tell them that they're not going to have access to a weatherization program. I just want to be very careful about that. On the issue of workmanship, though, 100% in agreement with you. And we can give Mr. Friedman's help in how we tighten that up. Now, Mr. Katz, the time that I have remaining, there's an assertion being made here that somehow this green energy and the potential for profit in it is some kind of a myth. You're an investor in this, right? Isn't this your background?
Yes, that's correct.
I mean, can investors make money investing in green energy or not?
Yes, they can. And
do they?
Yes, they do. There have been an increasing number of IPOs and sales to large corporates from firms that we've invested in. I'm on the board of Tendril, for example, which is a smart grid company that's benefited from ARA funding. Beginning of last year, they were in 100,000 homes. End of this year, it will be 4.2 million homes. We expect to get a 10x return on that. Some companies we've invested in.
What do you want to explain that for the uninitiated, a 10x return?
So investments are made in the hope that we're going to make money. That doesn't always happen. Part of the portfolio is expected to not perform well, and others are expected to perform well. In the case of clean energy, we're seeing more and more companies that are performing well over time, and as they get purchased or as they go public, the investors are returned money, and the expectation is that the money that they receive back exceeds the money they put in.
Let me ask you this. The Department of Defense is spending a lot of money on green energy research, is it not?
Yes.
Why?
They believe it reduces the cost for delivering support services in the field. They believe it reduces adverse security concerns. They believe it strengthens the military. They believe that clean energy is a more cost-effective way of delivering their obligation.
And have you worked with people in the Department of Defense on any of these energy issues?
Yes, I have. They're very excited about it. They think that it strengthens security in a lot of different ways, and on a cost-effectiveness basis is a smart investment strategy.
And I think it would be interesting for us to have a hearing just with the Department of Defense on this issue, because what we're seeing is that those people who are inevitably charged to intervene on energy-related issues, with the geopolitics being what they are are themselves cognizant of the imperative of moving towards green energy. And if the largest part of our, if the institution that drives one of the largest parts of the Federal Government is showing an interest in green energy, I think that not only should this committee pay attention to that, but I also think that Wall Street ought to be paying attention to that as well. Thank you, Mr. Katz. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I've just one follow-up question, if I could, with Mr. Friedman. The half the homes that you looked at that did not meet the standard, do you know who did the work? Was it a union contractor or non-union contractor? Do you know?
Well, Davis-Bacon, I don't know in those particular instances. Davis-Bacon, for the first time in its 35 or 40-year history, was introduced to the weatherization program as a result of the operation of the Recovery Act.
So it's likely that we were talking about union contractors doing this work?
I don't know. I can't answer that question, Mr.
Well, but what you're saying is this is Davis-Bacon is being applied now, right, with the stimulus. It's a requirement now, correct?
I apologize. Let me hear. I missed your statement. Go ahead, please.
Davis-Bacon is now required.
Correct.
You're charged with looking at stimulus dollars out the door.
Correct.
Your testimony was half the work done was not to standard, 9 out of 17.
Correct.
And so is it likely to conclude who did the work?
I can't make that conclusion because it could have been people who were non-union who were being paid Davis-Bacon wages.
Okay.
Would my friend yield?
Be happy to yield.
Since we're both from Ohio, I'll bet you a bag of Buckeyes that they weren't union contractors. Thank you.
Dr. Desjardins, the gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess just to kind of bring things back in focus, we're here today as a subcommittee of Oversight and Reform to take a look at stimulus oversight in this case, and the hearing, of course, is entitled "The Green Energy Debacle: Where Has All the Taxpayer Money Gone?" And that's really why we're here. We're all here to make sure that all the good taxpayers are getting the best for their tax dollars, and I think clearly the stimulus program has not lived up to its expectations. So, Mr. Friedman, just to kind of maybe try to put a cap on the weatherization issue, we've been beating that horse here for a while. I think about $5 billion of the stimulus money was set aside for weatherization projects for paid contractors and nonprofit groups to make the homes of low-income Americans more energy efficient. Being from Tennessee, I think that the program has revealed countless instances of waste, fraud, and abuse. And in an audit in Tennessee, the Inspector General found that 246 energy measures installed in 41 homes revealed only a third were shown to meet department-directed minimum energy savings to investment ratios. So your office has done investigations of stimulus-funded weatherization projects in many different states. Tennessee may be one, but what are some of the most egregious examples of the waste your office has uncovered?
Well, first, mischarging, that is, charging for work that was never accomplished. These are some of the schemes that we are currently investigating and have investigated. Secondly, paying premiums for products that could be purchased at lower cost. Third is charging for work that was never done in general. Fourth is abusing the priority sequence of those who could or should be receiving, who are eligible to receive the weatherization work, and those are 4 or 5 of the most significant findings. And of course, the whole question of substandard, the quality of work issue, in some cases it was actually life-threatening.
Is it true that weatherization funds can be used to purchase brand new refrigerators or air conditioners?
I don't want to give you an inaccurate answer. Certainly, furnaces would be appropriate. I don't know about. Did you say refrigerators?
Refrigerators, air conditioning units.
There are programs that will give premiums other than weatherization for purchasing new appliances that are energy efficient. I don't believe it was covered under the weatherization program.
Okay. I'm not sure that would be found anywhere in the Constitution that would be a right, but rumor has it that is the case. How much weatherization money do you think we could recover at this point of the $5 billion?
I would suspect that there will be very little that's recoverable at this point.
Okay. Changing gears just a little bit, I think there was an article in maybe the Washington Post this morning, but were the state and local governments ready to receive the massive amount of money that were allocated to them from the Department of Energy as part of the stimulus?
Unfortunately, they were not, and that was an issue that I think was predictable, and we, in fact, did anticipate that that would be a problem.
Okay. So you don't think it was very wise to send millions of dollars to local governments who are in the process of laying off workers because of the recession? They couldn't handle this influx of money. They weren't ready, and that contributed to the waste?
Well, not meaning to make a joke out of a very serious subject, it's been equated to attaching a lawn hose to a fire hydrant. The infrastructure, both at the Federal, State, and local level, simply was not there to accept the burden.
Okay. So you think that that was a great contributor to the inefficiencies and the waste that the office have seen?
Certainly.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Montgomery, you stated in your testimony that the mission of the Department of Energy and the purpose of the Recovery Act were not consistent. Could you please expand upon this point for us?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. Yes, the requirements of an effective energy technology development program are essentially stable, long-term funding. It also requires a careful selection process, especially if the money is being put in at the R&D stage, and that involves proposals, it involves peer review, it involves the formation of a program in which the R&D stages fit. None of that fits with the classic prescription for stimulus, which is get the money in fast and turn it off quickly when it's no longer needed. That's exactly the opposite of what the Department of Energy needs. And it's the way we have killed any number of useful programs in the past. For example, the solar energy initiative that I remember back in the 1970s and early 1980s was cut off just as it was beginning to get going somewhere, and in terms of production and bringing costs down.
Based on your decades of experience in energy policy, does the entire concept of promoting green jobs make economic sense?
Not through programs like the Recovery Act. I would say that green jobs are a solution in search of a problem. It's not a way of dealing with climate change. It's not a way of dealing with the government's responsibilities for R&D. It's not a way of dealing with the other environmental issues that we face. And it is certainly not a necessity for getting the U.S. economy to grow. It's something that may or may not happen if we put policies in place for those other objectives, but it is not a program that has policy significance of itself.
Okay, and I'm out of time. Thank you, gentlemen.
I thank the gentleman from Tennessee. We'll now recognize the Vice Chairman, and then followed by Mr. Kelly and Mr. Labrador. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Kelly is up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Montgomery, let's stay with you. I know in the opening statements we talked about one of the problems with our dependency on oil is that there's also a military investment made. If we were to do it domestically, if we had a really aggressive domestic energy policy where we actually used our own resources, we know that there's a third of the world's coal is underneath our surface. We know that in western Pennsylvania it's now being called the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. We have oil onshore, oil offshore. We've done an awful lot to hinder that development. And certainly, I listened to John Hofmeister early in the spring. He said there's 2 million jobs, a minimum of 2 million jobs waiting right now in the energy sector if we were to have an energy policy, a strategy that was aggressive. And I'm listening to what you're saying. So the cost of military, that's true. We do spend a lot of money in the military. But we wouldn't have to do it if we produced in our own country. And we wouldn't be spending petrodollars in countries whose ultimate goal is to annihilate us, and we're funding that process. I have a difficult time when I hear that, we want jobs right now, but we keep gaming ourselves, and this investment that we've made, and only in government, by the way. I've come from the private sector. And I love this idea of these green jobs, and you have to go after them. When you don't have to worry about a positive return on investment, you can waste a lot of taxpayer money. There's hardworking Americans whose money has been invested, and I keep hearing this, there's an element of risk. And I understand there's an element of risk, but when you take hard-earned American tax dollars and you throw it at an agenda rather than at a strategy, and you see the waste, I mean, it must really rankle somebody like you who've done your whole life, you've watched this happen. And it's just only in this town can you squander money and not worry about it because there's an endless supply of it. And if you don't have enough money for that project, don't worry. We'll get more money. We'll just raise taxes and we'll throw some more money at that and we'll reallot money to you. And I think that's really where we're at today. When we ask about this money has been wasted, there's nobody in the private sector that would continue to squander the capital that we're squandering right now on a reelection agenda and not on an energy policy that makes sense for America. And in all your work, would it be possible without government subsidies for these green jobs to go forward? Because you know what, I'll tell you what, in my district, and one of the local business owners, he has a marquee out in front of his place, he puts down green jobs equal red ink. And I'll tell you what, I think that guy has a better feel for what's going on with our policies right now than a lot of folks inside this beltway. So, I mean, really, without the subsidies, I mean, we talk about, well, yeah, General Motors is willing to invest in the Volt. No kidding. They got a safety net underneath them. I mean, market-driven means you can drive it off the lot. Somebody wants to buy it. Not you're going to throw somebody $7,500 of taxpayer money, federal money, and then $3,500 of Pennsylvania money for somebody to drive that car off the lot. And we're already seeing, by the way, and I know this because I'm a Chevy dealer, this great idea that we're going to produce 16,000 of these Volts this year. Well, we're selling about 500 a month. If you do the math, there's 10,000 Volts that are going to have no home to go to. And being a dealer, I know whose driveway they end up in or whose lot they end up in. Just tell me, without the government subsidies, who would venture into this wonderland, and I mean wonderland, wondering if it could possibly work if it was their own money?
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I think I heard 3 questions. So let me go back to the first one, which was—
It's more frustration than questions, I got to tell you.
Thank you. No, I think there were 3 topics I would like to talk about. The first one is energy security. Most of the green jobs that we are hearing about now are either in the weatherization area, which we've heard talked about, classifying construction, certain construction jobs as green, or they have to do with generating electricity, because in the short term, the technologies that we are deploying are largely electricity-related technologies. And the electricity technologies are already being supported by things like the state-level renewable portfolio standards and requirements of the various public, California's requirements for renewable energy. And that's making a market. Again, it's created by a government, but it's created by regulation. The opportunities in the near term for actually changing our oil imports are very, very limited on the green technology side, because biofuels are going to be a long time to develop. They require serious breakthroughs in order to accomplish something. Electric vehicles, I think you've described very accurately, that the market just does not exist for electric vehicles with the current prices of electricity and the current prices of these vehicles, except for people to whom they're a very expensive toy or people who will be given them for free. So what are we going to do about energy security? The Green Jobs Program is not affecting energy security, because if you define energy security as either reducing the amount of world's oil supply that's produced by our enemies or reducing U.S. oil imports, their production is probably the most rapid way that we can do something about it. The transportation sector is going to be very hard to get off oil, and electricity doesn't consume oil. So putting money into electric technologies doesn't affect that, our oil balance at all. As far as government subsidies go, yes, I think that once Congress made the decision that there was not going to be a price of carbon in the market, that there was not going to be a cap-and-trade program or a carbon tax, that means that any technology that was depending on that, any technology that's going to produce renewable energy at a cost that's 25% higher than burning coal, is not going to have a market beyond what's created by the state renewable portfolio standards. Which gets into a third important issue, I think, and maybe this will provoke, maybe you will let us have some debate among the panelists, but it's that Mr. Katz mentioned that investors can make money on clean energy. Well, certainly they can if they are selling into, wind turbines into a market where the RPS, the renewable portfolio standard, says the utilities must buy wind. Well, investors are going to make money selling wind. Actually, most of the wind is going to be, it's another trade issue about where the wind turbines are being purchased. But my question is, if a venture that was funded largely by private equity and made a 10 times return for its private equity investors when it was sold to a big company, why did it need Recovery Act funding? It seems to me that we are in a situation where if you can make a profit on doing something through private equity, you don't need the Recovery Act funding. And if there's not a market for the product, the Recovery Act funding is not going to be enough to create a sustained industry.
Thank you, Doctor. We now recognize Vice Chairman Ms. Burkle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for being here this morning. You know, many of us came here to Congress and part of the 2010 elections because of the economy, because of jobs, because of the state of what was going on in our country, and this notion that the government can spend money to create jobs. And the stimulus, which was touted as never going to get unemployment above 8%, we see that we've now got unemployment, and it's been there for 24-plus months at 9%, or hovering around 9%. So the Keynesian economics didn't work. Now we're being pushed another stimulus. Well, we need this an additional stimulus because the first stimulus wasn't enough. Now we're going to have the second stimulus, and we're going to spend money. And when I'm out in the district and I hear from some of the supporters of this notion, they say, well, it creates jobs, and we want to create jobs. And we all want to create jobs. We want to get this economy back on track. But the government can't do that. That's private sector's job. Private sector can do it. So we look at the stimulus, and my question is for Mr. Friedman. All of these jobs that were created, these green jobs, what happens when this money is spent? What happens to those jobs?
Well, Ms. Burkle, the Department's $35 billion plus its loan guarantee authority that came with the Recovery Act, there are a lot of different ways in which it was spent. But let me give you one example. As I reported in my testimony, the Department used a substantial amount of money to advance its environmental remediation program, remnants of the Manhattan Project, at sites around the country. And the money has dried up. The money has come to an end, and between 4,000 and 5,000 people will be losing their jobs between now and the end of December of this year. So you have to look at each bucket somewhat separately, and certainly in the case of the money that was spent for creation of these jobs, they come to an end, which is unfortunate for those individuals.
And so the arguments that we hear, well, let's spend this money to create jobs, these are short-term jobs, and we would be far better served to get a good, solid transportation bill in place, which would have shovel-ready jobs eventually, and those jobs and the funding would be available rather than this temporary spending. Mr. Friedman, I just want to talk a little bit about 1705, a loan program. And my question is, and I realize you're going to be looking into this, or you are looking into it, and you may not be able to comment on certain portions of it. But and this kind of goes to what Mr. Kelly was talking about, this notion that when the government is funding something, it's a endless pit. There's just more money to throw, and if it doesn't work, we'll just pour more money into it. When a program like Solyndra, when you identify that there's such a significant loss, is anything done to make a change midway through that program and saying, this isn't working and we need to restructure this program so it does work, so we're not throwing good money after bad and we're not wasting American taxpayers' money?
Well, Ms. Burkle, I can talk about the audit work that we've done with regard to the loan guarantee program. The most recent report was issued in March of this year, in which we identified problems in the way the Department documented, the way it addressed risks and mitigated those risks. I can certainly talk about that. But in terms of the specific case that you're referring to, we have acknowledged, as has the FBI and the Department of Justice, that we have an ongoing criminal investigation, and I can't comment beyond that.
And lastly, I have a few seconds left here. Aside from Solyndra, is your office concerned that there will be other losses with programs where we've given money to them and that the government, AKA the American taxpayers, will also sustain losses?
Well, at this point, I'm not in a position to, I have not evaluated every loan guarantee in the portfolio, so I'm not in a position to project or to anticipate what may occur or may not occur. So I can't give you a really thorough answer.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Now I recognize the gentleman from Baltimore, ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Cummings, and then Mr. Labrador.
Mr. Friedman, one of the things you said that was very interesting was that that part of the problem was that when these funds went to the states, that in some instances the employees who were responsible for dealing with these had furloughs. Furloughs were an issue, sir?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And was that, did you find that the case in many instances?
There were several jurisdictions, states in which that was the case, Mr. Cummings. And there's an irony there which is really unfortunate, which is that here we come to the states with a program that is designed in part to stimulate the economy and to create jobs, and yet the very people who would administer the program and apply the mechanics to the program and make it work were furloughed because of the condition of the state economy. It's an unfortunate irony, if that's the right word for it.
And to get these, I mean, it sounds like, and I think Mr. Lewis said something to this effect also, it seems as if there was an effort to get the programs up and running in a certain amount of time, and in an effort to do that, a lot of times all the mechanisms weren't in place to effectively accomplish that. Would that be a fair statement, Mr. Lewis?
Certainly, one of the premises of the Recovery Act was to get money out there quickly.
And
in the case of our programs, we did have a lot of new grantees who had not done labor programs before.
And DO's $535 million loan guarantee to Solyndra and its subsequent bankruptcy are well known. And on Monday, we learned that Beacon Power Corporation, which received $43 million in stimulus funds through the loan guarantee program, filed for bankruptcy on October 30th. Now, Mr. Friedman, isn't it true that DO's loan program's office was specifically designed to provide funding to companies that, because of the type of company, find it difficult to obtain funding from the private sector? Is that an accurate statement?
Earlier, I think before you returned to the room, I indicated I can't, because of a criminal investigation, discuss particular
I'm sorry.
But in terms of the generic question, you're absolutely correct. That was the reason for the program, and that was the reason that the office was created as well.
And isn't it true that these companies are generally pursuing, and I think this would be in your purview, pursuing cutting-edge technology from battery production to solar to even nuclear power? Is that an accurate statement?
I believe that's accurate, yes.
Isn't it true that the list of companies funded through DO's office involves almost 50 companies who have operations throughout the United States, and therefore, when we see some failures, wouldn't that be expected, given the high-risk nature of what they do?
I'm a little reluctant to get into the question of risk and outcomes, but obviously there is a risk. Otherwise, these firms would not need a government loan guarantee.
And when you look back on what you found, what were your recommendations?
Well, we recommended, with regard to the third of our reports, which was March of 2011, we recommended that the Department develop a much more robust system for documenting how it evaluates the risks with each individual applicant and how those risks are mitigated.
Now, did this money come under Devaney, Mr. Devaney?
I'm sorry?
Did this money come under Mr. Devaney's watch?
I am a member of the Recovery Act Accountability and Transparency Board. So I guess arguably all the Recovery Act money was within the purview of the board and Mr. Devaney. So the answer, I suppose, is yes, but this is a Department of Energy program.
I got you.
Outside of the RAT.
Well, let me tell you why I asked that. One of the things that he said is that he was trying to put in mechanisms by which he would prevent these things from happening, and I was just wondering, were there prevention efforts here, and if so, why do we have so many problems with that?
Is that directed to you?
Yes.
Certainly, there was a system of due diligence that was exercised by the Department. Was it adequate? That remains to be seen. And the due diligence effort, at least presumably, would have been to identify the risks, to determine what mitigating circumstances or what mitigating factors or controls can be put in place. Were the risks tolerable, and how you proceed from there. So yes, there was a due diligence process in place. The adequacy, I'm not sure I can comment on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Labrador.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield my time to you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. McMahon, and I really, these hearings are of great value, I think, to the American people, because it's the only time they really get to see how their money is being spent. I look at this as more of a stewardship than anything else. I know it's an elected office, but really we're stewards of American taxpayer money, and we have to be responsible for them for the way this money is being spent. So I've been here 9 months, but I come from the private sector, as you do. Can you discuss a little bit these green jobs? We found out in a prior hearing that a bus driver who's driving a diesel bus, when he switches over to an alternative energy bus, now becomes we created a green job. So the fact that the American public gets gamed so many times with these marketing efforts to take whatever it is that we're trying to achieve, and I really am at a struggle sometimes to go back home and tell people in Northwest Pennsylvania we're spending your money the right way. They say, really? We don't see it that way. So tell me, again, some of the green jobs that you see in your construction business.
Sure. They're actually, it's quite fascinating because they're actually all the same jobs that currently exist. The goal here is to just create a new label. It's just a misnomer to think that somebody who cuts wood from a sustainable forest has any skill that's any different from somebody who cuts wood that doesn't come from one. But if you were to ask the Department of Labor, this current Department of Labor, that is a new skill set somehow. It literally is, we've had carpenters for a long time. We've had sheet metal workers, reinforcing steel people that maybe they turn bolts to erect a wind turbine, but it's no different than building a coal-fired furnace a couple of years ago. I mean, literally, and you'll have people. We've done LEED standards were started in the early 1990s here in D.C. Actually, I actually worked for a guy who helped write them originally back in the early 90s, and we've done probably north of 100 LEED certified buildings, several hundred million square feet, just as a company ourselves. But there's no skill set difference between these two people. The idea here, really, what they were trying to do in the district was really quite nefarious, and it's nice that they just kind of laid it all out here. They're trying to take a zoning law, the D.C. Green Building Act, and claim that somehow there was a new skill set required to actually work on things covered that were considered green, and therefore create this place where they create a new apprenticeship standard. Now, I mean, I know that we, as a company, and every other merit shop contractor in the district area, we would all have had our, literally decades of apprenticeship standards trying to get them passed. We'd have them tossed, and therefore we'd be barred. And this wasn't the only jurisdiction that was attempted. Texas, Northern Virginia, a number of other places where attempt to use a zoning bill, claim that somehow the skill set required a new apprenticeship standard, and then people would have to recertify their programs. If I could just quickly answer one quick question I heard the ranking member discussing about Davis-Bacon wages. Back in Title 10 of the Energy Act that passed in the end of 2007, there was something included called the Clinton-Sanders Amendment. It altered the Workforce Investment Act. For the first time, you were required to actually have a union as a partner in order to qualify for any training grant funds. Furthermore, the union would, in a particular jurisdiction or covered by a particular trade, would have effectively veto power over any grant money that was expended. So it is in the law that they altered the Workforce Investment Act, which up till now, up to this point, had never considered union or non-union affiliation as far as grant funding. This actually requires that you have a union as a partner in order to qualify for the grant funding under the Green Jobs Act that the Inspector General is telling us about.
Thank you. And I do think, again, this is a forum for people like you coming out of the private sector to get a chance to actually speak to the American people. Mr. Lewis, Department of Labor, tell me some of these jobs that we were training people for, the skills that we were training them in.
Well, some of them are very technical. They are very technical skills related to the green energy industry. But some are, as you've heard this morning, they're jobs that can be just as easily applied to other industries. So we could be teaching people to weld for a green manufacturing entity, but they could use that skill set elsewhere. Our real concern in the results of this job at this point, and it is still interim, is that whether you call it a green job or not, we simply don't see the people getting a job, any job. The rate of placement to what they had intended for this program and compared to our other programs is significantly lower.
No, and I don't doubt for 1 second the intention, and I think government does this a lot, that the intentions are always great. It's just that I've seen much better results coming out of the private sector when it's your own skin in the game and you have to measure twice and cut once. You know you have that dollar to spend one time, and that's your dollar, and there's no backup. There's no safety net. So once it's gone, it's gone. And I think that's the whole purpose of the hearing today. Every penny we're talking about comes out of the American taxpayer's pocket. And not only do they deserve a positive return on that, they should expect that from us. And when we get to a point that we can no longer objectively describe where their money went, and if we have to relabel it or game it in order to make a failure look like it worked, I mean, I would say, Mr. McMahon, you and I have made many decisions in our life, and we go before the people that we represent, and we say, look, I made a mistake. I got to tell you, this isn't working. But we also don't have the benefit of unlimited sources of revenue and capital that we don't have to collateralize. And I think that's the danger of these programs. Well-intentioned or not, we end up in a situation where we continue to throw good money after bad because we can't stand and tell people, you know what, it was a bad policy. It was a bad program, and we need to backtrack now. We have money that's been appropriated but not yet spent. There's got to be a way to pull that money back and put it somewhere where it's actually going to have a positive effect. I can't tell you, I really appreciate all of you being here today. I know it's tough to take time out of your personal lives and come here, but it's important for the American people to understand that we do have an accountability that we must face with them. And if it's truly only going to be about reelection, then we shouldn't run again. It has to be about actually reforming what it is that we're doing. And if we're not doing it the right way, stand up and say, we made a mistake, and we're going to change it. So, again, thank you so much for being here. And at that point, I think the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.